session. All participants are required to mute their microphone. Until it is their turn to speak, and the committee will allow them to unmute their microphone. Before we begin, please, for all the participants, register yourself first at the present seat that has been shared in the form of a link in the Zoom chat features. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all the panelists and the attendants today. On behalf of the committee and the team, we would like to welcome each and every one of you in Youth Peatland Conference 2020 Day 2. Youth Peatland Conference 2020 is organized by Peatland Restoration Agency, Universitas Kristen Indonesia, Rumah Milenial Indonesia, and Pancasila University. We are also supported by Ruang Internasional and Journal Sociopolites. Ladies and gentlemen, over the whole 3 days, start from yesterday, this meeting had and will provide you with plenty of opportunities to discuss, sharing knowledge and insights. It is being a great pleasure and honor for me to be here watching all of you and welcoming each and every one of you in the 2020 Youth Peatland Conference. Before we proceed the program today, on behalf of the team, I would like to express our most sincere gratitude to the Excellency Deputy of Planning and Cooperation, Peatland Restoration Agency, Mr. Dr. Budi Aswardana, the Honorable Associate Professor of Communication and Arts, University of Queensland, Ms. Dr. Elske van der Vlier, the Honorable Senior Research Fellow, Integrated Tropical Peatland Research Program, National University of Singapore, Mr. Dr. Lahiru Wisdasam, and our respected sponsor and co-sponsor of the Youth Peatland Conference 2020. And last but not least, our distinguished guests and all of the participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Firstly, let us give thanks to our Lord Almighty, the Lord of the world and the universe, who blesses us with his blessings so that we can gather all today on 27 October 2020 to discuss our main topic, how to strengthen Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs in tropical peatland. Let him bless all of the process from the beginning until the end. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, Eliada Marianeska, as the Master of Ceremony, today that will guide this opening seminar on the second day of the Youth Peatland Conference 2020. But before we start our main agenda, and I'll give it to moderator, let me explain the rest of the schedule for the second day session of the conference. First, we had the opening session, and then we'll go first the seminar of the Sustainable Peatland Management, and then we will have design graphic presentation, and after that we will have break sessions, and we'll go for the full panel with technological topic, and then we'll go for the fifth panel with Sustainable Development Goals itself. And last but not least, we will have closing of the second day session of the 2020 Youth Peatland Conference. So, honorable distinguished speaker and all of the participants, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to our first agenda of the second day of Youth Peatland Conference 2020 seminar session will be led by Mr. Dr. Ferdinand Robertua Siahaan as our moderator. But first, allow me to introduce our moderator. That is Mr. Dr. Ferdinand Robertua Siahaan. Mr. Ferdinand got his bachelor degree in International Relations from University of Indonesia. and then got his master's degree in international relations from Linköping University, Sweden. He's also got his doctoral title from Pajajaran University, Bandung. He is a Vice Dean of Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Universitas Kristen Indonesia, and a full-time lecturer at the same place, while also being chief editor of journal Sociae Polites at Universitas Kristen Indonesia. So, the Excellency, Mr. Dr. Ferdinand Roberto Sihaan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elia. Do you hear my voice clear, Elia?
Yes, yes, sir.
Thank you. This is a very, very excellent opportunity to discuss about sustainable peatland management. And thank you for the chance given by the committee to me, appointed as this moderator. So allow me to moderate this very interesting panel about sustainable peatland management. Well, as introduced by Elia, my name is Ferdinand from Universitas Kristen Indonesia. And now I would like to call three distinguished speakers that will give us a lot of new knowledge, new insights about sustainable peatland management. There are three speakers. The first is from Badan Restorasi Gambut, Pak Budi Wardana. The second speaker from University of Queensland, wait, I have to say the full name. Elske van de Vliert. And the third speaker is from National University of Singapore, Dr. Lahiru S. Wijayadasa. So the rules of this panel would be like this, that each speaker will be given 15 to 20 minutes, but if it is not enough, then it is welcome to extend until 30 minutes. So the maximum would be 30 minutes. And there will be discussion afterwards. There will be discussion after all the presenter present their materials. And I would like to invite every audience that want to give questions. You can type the questions. You can mention the question in the chat box of the Zoom below. In the chat box, you can mention the questions. Of course, you have to tell yourself, to tell us the name and the affiliation. And it is welcome that you can ask in Bahasa Indonesia, because I will help you to translate into English. So everyone is invited to discuss about sustainable peatland management. And we do have plenty of time to have these discussions. I think it will be until 10:30 something. So before I give the panel to the speakers, I would like to introduce each speaker. So the first speaker, Pak Budi Wardana from Badan Restorasi Gambut. He is a very experienced environmentalist. Yeah, he has worked in WWF Indonesia, and he also graduated from University of Manchester on Environment and Development. And in BRG, Pak Budi is responsible for Deputy of Construction, Cooperation, and Planning and Mapping and Zonation of peatland. So I think we have no doubt about Pak Budi experience in sustainable peatland management. And the second speaker is Pak Lahiru from National University of Singapore, and also Senior Research Fellow, Integrated Tropical Peatland Research Program. And I would like to congratulate Pak Lahiru because he is recently graduated from his doctoral degree. Congratulations, sir. So Uh, Pak Lahiru also has wrote a lot of articles and involved in many projects on environmental projects, both in Indonesia, in Singapore, in many other countries as well. So I think this the experience of Pak Lahiru is very, very extensive. Welcome, Pak Lahiru, to this seminar.
Thank you,
And
Pak.
the last but not the least, Elske van der Vliert. Elske is associate professor in University of Queensland in the School of Communication and Art, and she focused on rural development and sustainable social change. Yeah. And she has done a lot of research and involved in many projects as well. I think the relevance of the research and the project is very relevant with us in this panel. So without further ado, I would like to give the first chance to Pak Budi Wardana. Pak Budi, time is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introductions and thank you also for the organizer. I would like to say hello to Ibu Elska and Pak Lahiru. We've met before in numbers of occasions. So actually Ibu Elska could speak Bahasa very fluently. So without further ado, I will share my screen. Yeah, I will give the title of Sustainable Peatland Management for the Youth Peatland Conference 2020 in D2. For those that have not yet visited any peatland in Indonesia, actually peatland is quite diverse in Indonesia. It is tropical peatland, but the conditions, the shape, and the surrounding situation is quite differs from one peatland to another peatland. So we call it peatland ecosystems with plural mentioning it. So it is a type of peatland, peatworms forest. It's quite pristine in this area. It's has trees, very tall trees, and also it is wetland, so it frequent by flooding, and the vegetations adapt to these conditions for thousands of years. This is another type of peatland which you can see not a lot of trees but shrub and open area, but it is really important. And also this is the people that live within and surrounding the peatland. It depends on the waterways, and the people can use peatland vegetations, for instance, purun for the handcraft, and also use the peatland area that is suitable for agriculture to make polyculture or agriculture in the swampy area. But what is peatland and peatland ecosystem? Peatland consists of peat actually, and the peat will depends on the climate, the water, and the vegetations that make accumulation of biomass possible.
Uh, I'm sorry, maybe there is a problem with the internet connection. Pak Budi, are you with us now?
Yeah, I'm still with you, and sorry for
Oh,
the sorry for the. It's really embarrassing to have these conditions where the internet connections is not really good for the presentations. But can you still see my screen?
yes, yes, Pak, very clear.
Okay, so what it is Peat, what it is Peatland, and what it is Peatland ecosystem will become the basic of sustainable management of peatlands. So it has a typical dome shape on the Omburu genus peatland. We have two types of peatland, tropical peatland in Indonesia. One peatland with the domes like this, and the other without dome. We call it topogenous peatland. It receives the water and some mineral from the flooded area, from the river. But for the Umburgenes peatland, the source of water is only from the precipitation, it's only from the rain. So typically this kind of Umburgenes peatland usually very poor in the nutrient. And to make a sustainable management of peatland area, we have to do the survey inventory. We have to know the extent and distribution and conditions of our peatland. And then after that, we design the functions of peatland. Because peatland, as it is, as an ecosystem, it's much more important to humanity because of this ecosystem, because of those ecosystem services provided by the landscape. For agriculture, actually, in the peatland area, especially on the dome, is not suitable because, as I mentioned before, the peatland is very poor in the nutrient that could support the non-wetland species. So the designation of functions will begin with the strategic environment analysis of the area, and then we determine the carrying and assimilative capacities, and then we designated the areas for the protections, or it is suitable for the cultivations. So then we do the land use planning. We designated the area as protected areas, or some area could be in the status of non-protected areas. It could be forested area, it could be non-state forest area, and it will give the land use licensing and title. It's also determine the area which has limited use area, and then with any other considerations that we should put before we do the sustainable peatland management. Actually, we apply the 12 principle of ecosystem approach. This one was under the decision of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity at the conference of the parties, the 5th conference of the parties, with the decisions 5/6. And then we do the policy, regulation, and then monitoring, and also enforcement, and the protection, and also sustainable management of peatland ecosystem, and then applications of the control of the land use licenses that the government give to the concession holders. And then eventually we do the monitoring and evaluations. We set the criteria and indicators for the sustainable peatland management, and we use remote sensing technology, and then we do the early warning system, as in the video, the previous video shows that this peatland is really a vulnerable ecosystem if it's degraded. The 12th principle of ecosystem approach, actually you can read under the website of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, especially on decision of the COP5 decision number 6. There are 12 principles from the objective management of land as a matter of social choice. Management should be decentralized at the lowest appropriate level, and so on and so forth. What I would like to focus on actually is on the principle number 1, the notions of a matter of social choice. Actually, the different actors, different sectors of society views ecosystem in terms of their own economic and cultural and societal needs. So it is naturally that during the negotiations of the member of the societies which live or affected by or depend on peatlands, they make decisions on how to manage the peatland. But the ecosystem itself should be managed for the intrinsic values and for the tangible and intangible benefit for humans in fair and equitable way, of course. That's the principles. And the principle number 4, recognizing potential gains from manage the ecosystem in economic context. Of course, peatland as resources, is biodiversity resources, should be used for the utmost prosperity of the people of Indonesia. But any such ecosystem management there should reduce the market distortions. So it should include the unaccountable cost of activities on those ecosystem. It's also aligned incentive to promote biodiversity conservation and also sustainable use, because ecosystem is part of biodiversity, and also internalize cost and benefit at a given ecosystem to the extent feasible. So the extent feasible mean that this project or activities might have boundaries by the license, but the impact of those activities might extend beyond the control of the management unit. So principle 6 and principle 7, which deal with the limit of the functioning. Peatland has its own functions, especially for the water regulations, the climate regulations, the provisioning of timber, fiber, food resources, and the habitat of protected species, the habitat of biodiversity, and the considerations of the appropriate spatial and temporal scales of the impact made by those activities that will be undertaken on those peatland. So there's note on the applications of the ecosystem approaches. Ecosystem approach requires adaptive management, because we know that the ecosystem is dynamic and complex, and sometimes we have a limited knowledge on the profile of the peatland. So some important aspect of the peatland might overlook during the planning, and then adaptive management should deal with that. The ecosystem processes are often non-linear, so it's not giving direct. So the more resources that you put on the peatland will eventually giving a bigger outcome at the scale of 1 to 1, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, but it is not those linear, and the outcome of such process often show time lags. For instance, the restorations of peatland that we do, sometimes the canal blocking that we do, the rewetting that we do, the revegetations that we do, will give the indications of the result within many years, within tens of years. But even it gives the indication of success within a couple of decades. So it's not shown directly. So it is the time lag that we need to consider. The result is sometimes discontinuities leading to surprise and uncertainty. Yes, it is because the accumulated knowledge before we do some management plan and the planning of activities and so on and so forth is not complete. But measures should be taken anyway, even when some cause and effect relations are not yet fully established scientifically. This is the implication, the applications of the precautionary principles. So the limited knowledge means that we should not act nothing. So limited knowledge gives us precautionary when we move and when we do something on those fragile ecosystem. So the sustainable management of peatlands and the SDGs. There are 7 of the 17 SDGs that directly related to the sustainable management of peatland. I would not read one by one, but actually the SDG number 1, no poverty, the restorations, the sustainable of management should have impact on alleviating the poverty. And then wetland with the paludiculture, SDG number 2, should contribute to the hunger, contribute to the zero hunger, to the objective of zero hunger, and also peatland as a wetland can provide ecotourism site, and also the climate and water regulatory services that provided by those peatland will be the basis of good health and well-being, and also provide clean water and sanitation, and some of the biomass from the residue of paludiculture, for instance, the stem of the green that we harvest from the paludiculture practices could be used as source of biomass for the energy. So the peatland also provide opportunity for the industry, innovation, and infrastructures, because the paludiculture offers wide range of innovations. For instance, instead of we plant palm oil, we could plant with jelutung, which provide the latex of jelutung, and the use of the jelutung is open for further innovations, and so on and so forth. And also the floodplains of the peatlands, while peatlands have the ecosystem services in retains and detains floodwater, will contribute to the sustainable cities and communities. It's also sustainable management practice as paludiculture make wetlands as engine of the local communities to have the sustainable livelihood also. System in terms of supporting the lumbung pangan, and also the peatland as a wetlands healthy, and if it's healthy will support the well functioning of the coastal wetland. In some area, even in Indonesia, we found that those ecosystem of peatlands is the main features of an island. We have island full of the peatland, such as in Pulau Bengkalis, and then Pulau the eastern part of Riau, of the province of Riau. There's a lot of island which comprise mostly on the peatland ecosystem. And life on land, as we have to conserve the biodiversity of Indonesia, we have around the 40% of world species live and breed in wetlands. So with that, with the ecosystem services that provided by the peatland, which has the global value, so there's a global opportunities for restoration and sustainable of peatlands. The last opportunity is when this year the UN Assembly declare the UN decade on ecosystem restorations, which lasts a decade, 10 years, starting from 2021 to 2030. So it is time for us with the global support for the restorations and sustainable management of peatland ecosystem. But unfortunately, those policy is not written on clean page. So the first regulations regarding the protections of peatland actually was enacted in 1990 as the bylaw, as the implementations of the basic law on the management of environment of 1982. We know as the Undang-Undang tentang ketentuan-ketentuan pokok pengelolaan lingkungan hidup. So that's first mention on the requirements of strategic impact assessments. The first mentioning on the AMDAL requirement, if activities of project have significant impact on the life of the people and also the supporting system, the life supporting systems, meaning the ecosystem that give life supporting system for the populations and also for the development. The newest law on environment protections and management was enacted in 2009, which mandated the government from the central to provincial to district level for them to formulate the, we call it RPPEG, so the protections and sustainable use of the ecosystem, the plan for the protections and sustainable use of peatland, and it should be incorporated within the RPJMD. So the medium term of development plan of those region, whether it is in the national level, the provincial or the district. So what we do actually corrective action, as I mentioned before, because when we enacted those law, there are already licensed on the peatland. There are the peatland is not on the pristine conditions. It's already degraded from the activities of human activities over the peatland. It might be on the places where the transmigrations located. It might be licensed for the palm oil. It might be licensed for the timber concession. It might be licensed for the industrial plantations for the pulp and paper. So we experience fast forest and land fires of 2015. We have 2.6 million hectares, which also affected large area of peatlands. But then the forest and land fire were reduced significantly from 2.6 in 2016. We still experienced 529,000 hectares, and reduced again in 2018 with around 165,000 hectares. But unfortunately, there's an increase in 2018. We have 438,000 hectares area burn. Part of those area also impacted on peatland. And 2019, the last years that we have, is 1.6 million hectares area of forest and land, including peatland, was burned. So this year until 30 September 2020, we recorded around 206,000 hectares area of peat, including peat of forest and land fire. This evident that we have mismanagement of peatland. Massive clearing of peatland still happen. The mismanagement of land, of peatland that already been open for cultivation still happen. So the law number 32 of 2009 for the protections and sustainable management of peatland request us for the RPPG as the reference for the prevent further damage. Sorry. And should contain the directions for the utilization and preservation of peat ecosystem, peatland ecosystem, maintenance and protections and of the quality and ecosystem services of peatland, control and monitor the utilization and preservation of peat ecosystem, and of course the activities for the mitigation and adaptations related to climate change. So as a model of landscape management, this is illustrations of current peatland conditions that we have. Part of the areas, sorry, part of the area in green here is still protected areas, is still intact forest, but some area is already under the management of local community. Some area already for the pulp and paper concession, and some area is the area for the palm oil concessions, and some area is still considered as open access. Anybody can use those area, but those area without control is the area that usually become the area that prone to fire, because the cheapest way to open the area and clear the area is using fire. So we need coordination among the stakeholders, because remember we in the ecosystem approach, the principle one is the sustainable management of peatland is a matter of societal choice. For the local community managed area, we need to provide them with the paludiculture and with the peatland friendly agricultural practices, which BRG is also practicing in the revitalizations of the socio-economic conditions of the local community. Even with the Desa Peduli Gambut Peat Care Village, the programs for the capacity building of the village level, that the village has some area of peatlands. We do the supervisions of the concession holders on how they manage the water table, to manage the water infrastructures, the water management infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And some of the area is open for the concession, ecosystem restoration concessions, which could generate or produce emission reduction unit through the protections of intact area or intact peatland and the rehabilitations of degraded peatlands. So, because this conference entitled Youth Peatland for the youth for the peatland sustainable use and SDGs. So I will a bit touch upon the role of youth as agent of change. So young generation is not only beneficiaries of the policy and the development process, they are important actors in achieving the development goals, because young generation has great potential to make a difference, not only for themselves, but also for the society and the whole world, because of the benefits of age, strength, endurance, energy. They have time, they thirst of novelties and numbers. They are also a future leaders. It is very important for the young generation to be well informed, capacity and opportunity. They have to be open for the capacity and opportunity and engage the future vision of the future, including the vision of the green peatland. So young generations are no longer only part of the goals of the sustainable development goals, but will also the main driving force for the successful implementation of SDGs. The youth population is growing in some part, but also because of the welfare of the conditions in some regions, the old age will the portions of old age is growing also, but the young generations, the youth, it's also important, it's also significant to give voice and to fight for the environmental degradations. They have to voice the environmental degradations. They have to voice the inequality and act upon, and also demanding the end of the environmental degradations and the end of inequality. The SDGs strive for prosperity and economic property, better and more equitable social welfare, environmental protections, all that could voice, all that the young generation could voice for the close society, the close community that they live, and even at the global level. So the role of youth on Peatland Forum, the Peatland Conference, we hope that the youth on Peatland Conference will representing the need of young generation and the voiceless in the society. Keep updated into the issues of the common while taking interest into current development agendas. Comprehend the issues and empower yourself, educate yourself, knowledge, communications at scale, speak out clearly and eloquently. So that's all. The youth is important because the youth comprise nearly 30% of the world populations. The involvement of today's youth in the environment and development decision-making and the implementations of the program is critical to the safety of the one and only planet that we live in, thus the safety of our species. So thank you. Back to you, Pak Ferdinand.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pak Budi. You have presented a very comprehensive knowledge about sustainable peatland management, and most importantly, you elaborated the role of youth in sustainable peatland management. I think we agree with Pak Budi presentation that youth is not only beneficiary but also the actor of sustainable peatland management. Thank you, Pak Budi. Now, I would like to proceed to the second speaker from Singapore, Lahiru Wijedasa. Pak Lahiru, are you with us? Can you connect with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, nice, thank you. So time is yours, Pak Lahiru, 20 minutes to 30 minutes from now.
Okay, let me just share my, it says that the host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, the committee, could you connect Pak Lahiru as the co-host?
Okay, I think it's okay now.
Okay.
All right, can you see my screen?
Very clear, Pak.
Okay. So I would first like to say selamat pagi. Thank you for inviting me, Pak Ferdinand, Pak Budi, and Pak Elska. Happy to be here on this panel today. Also, welcome to everyone else. As Pak Ferdinand mentioned, I just finished my PhD earlier this year. All of it was it was 5 years in Indonesia. And if I had a chance, I'd still be in Indonesia right now. And I hope to come back soon. What I would like to tell the youth in the beginning, of course, is that when I first started the PhD, it was the first year that BRG was established. And in 2015, I did a presentation in Jakarta when BRG was just starting. And then now 5 years later, I can actually see how complicated everything is, and what BRG has achieved so far is superhuman in that context. It's different from anything done anywhere on the planet. And I think as you should be proud of having an agency like this that has done so much. Also, that as students, your PhD or whatever you're doing, you're studying, is a journey. And you will change as you go through it. And what I will show you is some of the things that I found, but I'm focusing mainly on the future, where I think that because everyone, whatever you study, whatever you do, it's a journey, and you have a journey, but the journey has to continue, and other people will continue what you do. And that's where I'm coming from here. Pak Budi has given us a really good outline of things, and he has really simplified a lot of things that they have done, which is very complicated and very difficult. He makes it sound like it's so simple, but it is extremely difficult to do what they have done so far. So we do owe them a huge amount of gratitude for that. This presentation is also done with Prof. Susan Page, who is my co-collaborator, and we've worked many years in Indonesia together, and we will hope to continue for longer. So like Pak Budi mentioned, what is a peat swamp? The peat swamp is interesting because what you have is mostly organic matter falling into wet areas. So I'll just give you a bit of the science. Once organic matter falls into wet areas, it doesn't decompose, so the organic matter accumulates. So what we have is that over time, the organic matter accumulates, and you can have over 20 meters deep organic matter and a lot of carbon. And I'll tell you how much carbon in a little while. But at the same time, you have this unique ecosystem where the trees and the soil and the water and the landscape and the people, everything is an interaction working together, and it's in balance. The issue is that what happens when we change the balance, and that's what I'll show you in a little while. Yeah, so this is an example from what peatlands actually do. And this example is from northern Borneo. This is Miri in Sarawak, and this is where Brunei is now today. And 800 years ago, can you hear me?
Yeah, Pak. Yeah, Pak. Very clear.
Okay, so about 3,000 years ago, most of Brunei didn't exist. It was mainly sea. And in the inlands, you had these mountains and you had the mangroves starting. And most of Southeast Asia's peatlands are like this, that as the mangroves go out towards the sea, the back part starts becoming fresh water and less water exchange, and the carbon starts accumulating. So after a while, what you get is, you get the mangroves going all the way out there, and they're replaced by peat swamps. So huge amounts of carbon, and so I call it natural land reclamation, because what we're really seeing is that what was originally the sea has become land because of these mangroves and these peat. And it has happened very quickly. If you look at Southeast Asia, 21% of the land area of Peninsula of Malaysia, Sumatra, Borneo, 21% of the land area is peatland. 21%, that's a huge amount. We're talking about 210,000 kilometers, huge areas. And Singapore is just a tiny dot here, right? Of 700 square kilometers. So this is a few hundred times more in area. And if you look at these numbers, these are the carbon dates. That means the oldest peatland depth that we know is only 5,000 years in Sumatra, somewhere here. So that means 5,000 years ago, the sea line was somewhere there. So all this land exists because of the peatlands. The peatlands have reclaimed land from the sea. What we do in Singapore, spending billions of dollars, has happened naturally across Southeast Asia. And it's important because it's happened on a very short time scale. Very quickly, the land has been reclaimed, relatively. I mean, 1,000 years is old. But an interesting thing about it is that there's a huge relationship between the vegetation and the plants. That's why when Pak Budi mentioned that the water tables are there and everything, It's not so simple. It's fluctuating water tables. In 2015, I said that peat swamps are probably the hardest ecosystem to study and restore because everything is fluctuating. The water tables are going up in the rain, it's going down when it's not raining, it's going up and down all the time. And the plants are really adapted to grow in this. And along with that, you get a lot of different species. Now, this species is in Indonesia. This is the smallest vertebrate on the planet, with an animal with a backbone. This is only, I think, 3 or 4 millimeters long, and it's an adult fish. My first project before I started vegetation was actually studying fish. And this fish is interesting because it had been collected 20 years before, but people thought that it was a young fish of an adult. But 20 years later, someone looked under a microscope and found the reproductive organs, and they realized that this is actually an adult fish, and it was described as Pedocypris. Other interesting thing is like orangutans. There is double the density of orangutans in peat swamp forest than in mineral soils. And the reason is that in peat swamps, there's not many seeds in the soil, so most trees are flowering and fruiting all the time. So you have double the densities of orangutans on peat than on mineral soils. And then you get endemic birds, and what I study is also plants. Every single swamp that I've been to, I found new species of plants. When it comes to fish, there's 250 to 350 species of fish, and 103 are only found in peat swamps. A bit more about the fish. This is actually a map of the licorice gourami, some work done by Lucas Ruber from Germany in collaboration with Indonesia. Every single color shows you a species. And if you notice, there's many dots only found in one location. And that means that fish species is only found in that one swamp. And if that one swamp goes, that species goes extinct. And this is just one species. And this one species, you can see how many different colors of dots on this. And that's the same for every one of these species. They are found in so high numbers in endemics. And these are what goes into the aquarium industry. So they go into the aquarium industry and they're known around the world, but most people don't know that they are mostly found from, like you look at this dot, only a single location. So what BRG and Indonesia are doing through better managing their forests is also in the same time conserving these species from going extinct. And the reason that you have these beautiful colors is because peat swamps are black water. If you have black water and not so visible, you can have beautiful colors because the predators won't see you. And at the same time, like for instance, the fighting fish that we have, there are more fighting fish species in Indonesia than in captivity. The ones that we have is only a single species in captivity, but there's about 60 or 70 species. In a map like this, you can add them as well. And it's interesting because it's important for conservation. So the other side of it, when we talk about climate change, is the carbon. So how much carbon is actually in the peat swamps? And to give you an example, Southeast Asian peatlands, we estimate that there's about 69 gigatons. In the atmosphere, there is 750 gigatons of carbon. That means that the Indonesian and Malaysian peat and Bruneian peat swamps, the total carbon in those is equal to 10% of all the atmospheric carbon in the whole world. 10% is a huge amount. That means if you lose all the peatlands, there will be a 10% increase in atmospheric carbon. And that's a humongous number. So that's why it's important also in the context of carbon. So, but what happens when we have to change this system? So we have this intact system where you have a forest, and like what Budi mentioned, you have a water table, which is like if you have a dome, the water table follows the dome and it goes up and down. It fluctuates with the rainfall. But the issue is that when we want to do agriculture, we need to drain it. What happens is we cut the forest and we build drains. Now, why do we drain it? The issue is that the crops that we're growing on peat right now, which is oil palm and acacia, are actually mineral soil crops that we're growing on a wetland. So by draining it, we are changing the wetland into a dryland and planting dryland crops on it. And the result of that is that when you grow a dryland crop on it, can you remember I mentioned that the reason that the peat exists is because of organic matter falling into water. So if you change the conditions that you're draining the peat starts decomposing. Organic matter is not accumulating, so it starts sinking slowly. And what happens is you get this carbon which was there, which was not lost because of high water tables, is now slowly being lost. And so you get high emissions. But more than the emissions, what we're really worried is that if your soil is 80% made of organic carbon, if your soil is going into the atmosphere, you are losing your soil. It's almost like erosion to the atmosphere, and your soil is slowly going down. So there is a timeline. At some point, when all the carbon goes away, which is lost in above ground fires or drainage, at some point your peatland surface will sink to the level of either the sea level or the river level. And at that point, you cannot drain it anymore. So your areas get flooded. So the issue is to think long term, that it's easy for us to point these things out, but it's much more complicated than that. Because the reason it's more complicated is because of the agriculture growing on the peat. We cannot deny the fact that this agriculture growing on peat has pulled a lot of people out of poverty. A lot of people depend on peatland agriculture for their sustenance, whether it's big companies or whether it's smallholder agriculture. All of this is extremely important. And you can't just say that, okay, because we want to protect the peat, we should raise them and wet them and everything and move the people away. You can't do that. It's so complicated in what needs to be done that we can't just say that, oh, this is the solution, let's do that. That doesn't work. And to give you some numbers, it's like, we know that when it comes to this, and I call it balancing food security, livelihoods, and climate, because we haven't balanced it yet. We are in the process of heading towards the balance. And there is no one solution that we can apply. If there was a single solution for peatland agriculture that was not drainage based, that also creates livelihood, Indonesia would have applied it. Everyone would have applied it, but it doesn't exist. And that's why it's a challenge for the youth, because we are in a process where we're headed towards that direction. We need young people to come in and also participate in this process. That now, for instance, in these numbers, the smallholder agriculture is almost 43% of the agriculture on peatland is smallholder. It's almost as big as, it's bigger than oil palm and bigger than acacia alone. But the issue about it is, in the same time that this deforestation and conversion to agriculture was happening, between 1999 and 2020, Indonesian poverty reduced from 20% to 9.4%. Huge reductions in poverty. And if we consider that Indonesian population today is 270 million, we're talking about almost 20 and 25 million people pulled out of poverty in the same period. So while we have this issue with peatlands, we also have poverty alleviation happening. And at the same time, Indonesia moved from a low income to a upper middle income country. But at that same time, we still have 26 million people in Indonesia below the poverty line. So that's the challenge. That's the whole challenge of how do we do this sustainable agriculture on peatlands, save the peatlands while pulling people out of poverty and keeping people out of poverty. That's the easy thing. And when I first started in Indonesia in 2015, I understood the conservation side and the deforestation and the carbon side, but it's only after spending 5 years in Indonesia on the ground that I understood the social aspect of it. That how difficult it is, that what BRG has to do is they have to balance all of this. It's not that simple, and it's really complicated. So what they have really done is really, really significant and important. And when we consider it, that like in this context, if you look at that, what's happening on Indonesian agriculture on peat in the global context, there's actually, it's not only Indonesia where it's happened. In Europe, they actually deforested their peatlands, and a lot of the peatland drainage-based emissions coming out of the world, if you look at these two peaks, this is the latitude, and this is the amount of emissions. The Indonesian emissions or the tropical emissions from peatland are similar to the temperate emissions from peatland emissions. So we have two similar problems in both places. The difference is that in Europe, most of their peatlands are inland. And because their peatlands are inland, if the peat is vanished, they still have the land left, but not everywhere. And I'll show you an example where it's not the case. But in Indonesia and Malaysia, most of our peatlands are coastal. So if our peat vanishes, our peat goes below sea level, we lose the land. And that is a challenge. And that is a challenge not just for us studying this today, but it's for a challenge for your youth, because this journey to find a solution that's sustainable is a 20 to 30 to 40 year search for it. And we need the youth to participate in that. And that's why, like, even in BRG, most of the young people in there are already doing a lot of this. So it's not a problem that's just really a problem focused on sustainability in Indonesia. It's a global problem, and everyone has this issue. And I'll give you an example. We were talking about Europe. I'm going to give you an example of the loss of peat example, one from Europe, one from Asia. This is the Netherlands in 500 BC. In brown is peat. Most of the Netherlands was like originally peat. If you look at it, at least 80% of the Netherlands was peat in 500 BC. They started converting it to agriculture and other things very early. And by 800 AD, huge areas of peat had already vanished. And you can see, right, because the Netherlands is coastal, it's so low lying that the minute you lose peat, your peat, you kind of sink into the sea. And by 1500 AD, you can look at the amount of land that has been lost in Netherlands. At least about 40% of the land, I would think, was lost to the sea. But what they've done today is they've built up all these dikes and polders. They spend billions of dollars every year just pumping the water out so that the Netherlands can still exist. The issue is that the Netherlands is a tiny, tiny dot. When you consider the size of Indonesia, Indonesia is so much bigger, or even Malaysia is so much bigger than this. And in a good example, I'll give you an example of an area of the similar size. I showed you this same location earlier. This was Brunei. Like this is Malaysia and Brunei. This river separates Malaysia on the left, Brunei on the right. So in 1950, most of it was forested, and all this dark green is peat. Sorry, it's going to the meeting room. By 2015, this is actually oil palm. A lot of the areas were converted to oil palm by 2015. And all these peatlands have been subsiding since they were converted. And the projection is by 2075, if this current sinking of peat continues in Malaysia, huge areas of Brunei, which have not done any deforestation, will also sink into the sea. The reason is it's a unitary dome. And like Pak Budi mentioned, you have the single hydrological unit. You cannot drain part of it and conserve part of it. You need a proper management for the whole thing. And in this case, what you have is there's a national boundary, which is separating the management. So the Malaysian side manages it one way, the Bruneian side manages it one way, but eventually it's one thing. We are all united in the same thing that the peat domes are united, so you can't. And the good example is when I went to the Netherlands, you can actually see in the Netherlands this issue about houses. You go to the Netherlands and you see all these houses on these peat areas or former peat areas, and you can see the angles of the houses and the windows. They're all sinking. They're all sinking at different angles, and this is Amsterdam. And the same thing, this is in Sumatra. This is in Tembilahan, where you can actually see the houses planting at the same time. So it's a problem that's not restricted to Indonesia. It's a global problem, and everyone needs to participate. And that's why it's good to be in Indonesia and do a lot of work in Indonesia, because there's an open exchange of ideas, and there's an open discussion of stuff, and an open search for solution. There's no hiding behind barriers or anything like that. There's a discussion, and it's always open. Which what Pak Budi mentioned, it's for the youth of today to get involved in, to know what the issues are. Don't believe anything I say or anyone says. Go and see it yourself. Come up with your own ideas, come up with your own views. And for Indonesia, that's what I did as well. I didn't understand Indonesia until I went to Indonesia, and I went to the peatlands all over the place, went for meetings, went talk to people, and I understood. And as you do that, there's so many opportunities for you to do that. Just go and talk to people. And then, of course, what is the way forward? Now, this is where it becomes very complicated, and I'm trying to simplify what Pak Budi mentioned in 3 slides. So it's very difficult. So to do the peatland stuff, to do this entire sustainability thing and land use thing and everything together is not simple. It's very difficult. One thing you need is legislation. You need laws. Now, most ministries just do laws, but in BRD's thing, they also need to do land use planning. Not only do they need to set up a law, they need to work with all the ministries to land use plan to fit the laws together. On top of that, you also need to find the livelihoods for the people, and you need to finance it. So BRD has to do all of these things together. And on top of that, how do these interactions work? Of course, legislation and land use planning, you have land use tenure. It's not only good enough to have a law and have a land use plan, you need to make it work on the ground. To make it work on the ground, you need to spend time on the ground. You need to work with people to do that. So that's difficult. And then, of course, you need to enforce it, because you can't just have laws and land use plans and people agreeing. You need to make sure they do it. And then at the same time, you need to do this thing about alternative agriculture, which is palliculture and everything. So you imagine like one agency, the BRD, has to do these 6 things at one time, all together across 2 or 3 million hectares of land scattered everywhere. It's a lot of work, and it's very difficult. That's why it's a challenge that they have taken. They never said they can't do it. They did their best, and they continue to do their best. But in one thing that what Pak Budi mentioned, he said that it's up to the youth, because actually governments can only act if their people want them to act. What we first need is we want people to change. They want people to understand the problems. We want people. It can never work if someone tells them, you have to do this, you have to do that. It doesn't work. It has to be participatory. Even if you want to save one single species of fish, the people might want to do it. We can't tell, we can, but there is a need, of course, that sometimes people cannot see the need for it. They will say, okay, I'll lose one species of fish. But if you lose one species of fish and it goes, and those dots are like only found there, nowhere else in the world. And if you lose that dot, it goes extinct globally. And we have a responsibility also as human beings to also save things that are not necessarily directly beneficial to us. Like a fish in a swamp may not have a direct benefit, but it's important for us as human beings to be able to protect those that cannot protect themselves. And that's where, like, when you come to this BRG, what BRG has been doing, of course, the rewetting, revegetation, and revitalization, that brings all of these things together. That's just the land use planning and the legislation together. That alone, trying to do that is very, very complicated. And most ministries will only do one of these things. They won't do all of these things. So to do all of them is very, very complicated. And to do it on a landscape level, to put that action plan into action, 5 years is a very short time to do all of that. So to do what they have done so far is quite something. And then when we see this in planning, of course, we also see this legislation and land use planning. And this is an example from the east coast of Sumatra. Singapore is up here. This is Kampar Peninsula. Jambi city is behind this. And we have, of course, 4 big patches of peat swamp forest left. So it's not just about communities that they're working in there also. We have Burbak National Park, which has problems, of course, but they're being acted on. Then we also have company participation also. So we have the Riau Ecosystem Restoration Project, and of course the Kiam Siak Kecil Man and Biosphere Reserve. Now these kind of things, people never hear about it. I mean, they are there in the background. They're not even trying to get money for their carbon, but they are there doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. And it's important to notice that, like, this is a projection for what would have happened if there was no action. If there's no action, we would have lost a lot of these forest areas, but a lot of forest areas that could have been lost are also saved because of action. We don't hear them. So just because we don't hear doesn't mean that things aren't happening. There are also difficult, bad things happening, but there are also good things happening as well. And in the context of how big the area is and how big the problem is, I think it's quite significant. And of course, the Karamutan National Park is also there, and we don't actually know what's going to happen yet. And the other way forward that the last bit I want to talk about now is something that I think is important, which is alternative agriculture, which is a difficult part. And the reason I mention this is that if there was a system in Indonesia, if there was a system of agriculture that did not require drainage, that provided enough agriculture crops and money for societies to be pulled out of poverty to live sustainably, that would be done immediately, but it doesn't exist. And that's where the work that we do now matters. That work will take 30 or 40 years before we find that solution. And if we don't find a solution, of course, we will have to restore some of the peatlands before they get flooded. Yeah. And to show you just one example of that, we have this intact peat swamp forest, which is here. And the way forward is that we move from that intact peat swamp forest to a drainage-based agriculture, which is drainage. And what we want is a system which is non-drainage based, but with crops that can provide an income for people without resulting in peat loss. That means there has to either be peat formation or at least carbon neutral. So that means your peatland, because most of the coastal peatlands are only 2 or 3 meters above sea level, most of them. So if your peatlands are 2 or 3 meters above sea level and you lose about 1 meter or 2 meters, when sea level rises and your peatland sinks, we are going to lose the land. So this is the challenge for the future, sustainable alternative agriculture, and that is the challenge. One thing we did is we did this recent paper that we reviewed what's been happening in, like I mentioned, there's only 2 places where peatland agriculture is causing a lot of drainage issues. One is in the northern peatlands, and the other one is in Southeast Asia. And in the northern peatlands as well, even though there's this research on paludiculture, we don't actually have a solution yet. We know that paludiculture on peat now can actually reduce the number of reduce emissions overall, but it can't. But it's not a long term. It doesn't stop carbon loss. And the same applies for what we have in Southeast Asia. So we need that research to be done, and it's a 30-year process, which I hope, to me, everyone will get involved in. So that's a. So the last slide, of course, is I would like to end by saying terima kasih for all of you for attending and taking an interest in Peat. And I'd like to end with this diagram here, which is actually showing everything that Peat has been doing. And as youth, whatever you like to do, you can participate in any part of that. And any part of that is important for sustainable peatland management in the long term, whether it's a search for a solution, whether it's legislation, whether it's enforcement or land use planning, wherever you go, whatever you do, there is a way that it could be linked to peatlands or any other kind of land use planning or sustainable land management in Indonesia. And as youth, I'd like to end by saying that whatever you're learning now, whatever you're doing is a journey. Whatever you study now might not be the last thing you do. It'll probably be one of the things that guides the way you think and do stuff. And it's only because at some point, young people like you started on a journey like what I did or what the people in BRG are doing, that we have what we have today. The reason we still have forest standing is because of the youth. And everyone who's there now was youth some time ago, and they were passionate about something. Just find what you're passionate about, peatlands or otherwise, and follow it. Follow it to the end and don't stop. Thank you, Pak Ferdinand. Terima kasih.
Luar biasa. Thank you, Pak Lahiru, for your provocative presentation. Yeah, you're not only telling us the importance of sustainable peatland management for Indonesian society, but you also provoke the motivations of the young people to conserve, to protect the peatland. And for me, the most important slide is your way forward. It's very, very optimistic. I really hope that there are some members of the parliament in this Zoom meeting, so they can hear you, so we can be as same as optimistic as you, Pak Lahiru. Okay, so we will proceed to the third speaker, Bu Elske. Before that, I would like to give a reminder that if you have any questions, please put that in the comment box in the Zoom. I will read it in the discussion after Bu Elske presentations. It will be 30 to 40 minutes of discussions after the Bu Elske presentation. Now, I would like to welcome Bu Elske. Bu Elske, can you connect with us now?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, time is yours.
Thanks very much, Pa Ferdinand and Pa Lahiro. Nice to meet you both. And I also want to say hello to Pa Budi. Senang bertemu kembali. I need to share my screen, but I'm still disabled in that sense. So if the hosts can allow me screen sharing.
The committee, could you co-host?
Yeah, I've got it. Okay, thank you very much. I first would like to resonate with everybody else, or particularly with Lahiro, about how study is a journey. I saw from the participants that many of you are students, and although I'll be presenting about communication, and I was introduced as a communication for social change expert. My bachelor was actually in biology and ecology, and you see where you can end up in the end. And so I was always very interested in development and in ecological processes, and I ended up working in agriculture, particularly integrated pest management. Did my PhD in Indonesia starting the late 1980s, a long time ago, and I lived a long time there. But then I realized that what really counts to make change is the people. So that's why I slowly got into that, into actually understanding and trying to research and also work on that interface of both the technical innovations as well as communication and behavioral change, and then particularly social change, because just changing behaviors is not enough for sustained change. We need really to have that social change, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. So I was asked to talk a little bit about promoting public awareness and community engagement for sustainable peatland management, ingredients for an effective communication strategy. And this, of course, working on communication for development and communication strategy is part of my work, but I particularly had the opportunity to work with the BRG, as Pak Budi also mentioned, last year when I took 2 groups of students at different times to Indonesia, Australian students to Indonesia to work with the BRG and actually do what we call a transdisciplinary project. So with students from environmental management, from law, from communication and from other science topics in social science, who together had to understand the issues of the peatland management and particularly community engagement. And you know, they spent a week in a rural community. They talked to government and had to provide some recommendations to the BRG, you know, what could be done on top of the already great work that is being done by the BRG. I fully agree with Lahiru as well on that. But how community can be further engaged and eventually take control, because in the end, the BRG is an institution with a certain life period, but won't be there forever. It may be integrated into government, but in the end, it's the people who have to make that change. So how can people now be more actively involved and take ownership so that there will be sustainable development going on? So I'll talk a little bit about the nature of sustainable development and what that then implies for both peatland management as well as for communication for development. I'll talk about public awareness and community engagement, why that is needed, a bit about communication, and then the ingredients of a communication strategy. So sustainable development, you know, of course, that really became a buzzword in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and it's kind of come and gone in waves, and it's now very hot again. But initially, it was formulated by in the Brundtland Report, which was a major document that introduced this into policy, was that it is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's very relevant, of course, for young people, because you don't, you know, you have to carry on what was left behind and also, again, create you know, the suitable environments, both social and environmental and economic, for your children, your grandchildren, and whatnot. So most development at that time really had an economic focus. It was all about economic growth, you know, and but then we realized there were a lot of course, environmental impacts. There were social impacts. You know, the gap between the rich and the poor became wider. You know, a lot of environments got degraded. So sustainable development really had those 4 targets. It had to be economically viable. Not necessarily most profitable, but viable. There had to be social justice, so everyone gets a chance. There had to be environmental protection, and to achieve all that, there needs to be political commitment. And you see there, I put also the picture of the Sustainable Development Goals, which it has become a global agenda, not only like the Millennium Development Goals for the kind of the developing countries. The Sustainable Development Goals are a global agenda, applies as much in Indonesia as it does in Australia, as it does in Europe, because we have those issues everywhere, you know. And you see there's these 17 goals. Pak Budi already showed how 11 of them are relevant to peatland management. But we see they are individual agendas, but they also intersect a lot. You know, we cannot actually look at poverty alleviation, you know, in many areas, particularly in rural Indonesia, when you also look at hunger, eradicating hunger, or at, for instance, looking at climate change or the environment. So it is an extremely complex agenda. And here you see in this diagram is where, you know, that was developed also in the 1990s by the British government. The Sustainable Livelihoods Framework is that, you know, we can't only look at financial capital or financial economic kind of gains. We have to look at the environmental or the natural capital. We have to look at the human capital, because it's the people who have to make the change and maintain the change, the social capital, the relations and the leadership, and then the physical capital, which is the infrastructure. So that, what does that mean for peatland management? It means that we cannot only look at, at the technical aspects. And what I remember of the people from the BRG, Pak Budi, Pak Susilo, they always say, oh, the technical aspects are actually very simple. We have the science, we know how to do this. But in the end, it's about, having the people to do it, having the legislation in place to make sure that it is being done in the right place, having also industry involved. So it is about the land management, either managing, utilizing, or restoring and conserving. So that has to be planned very carefully. But it's also about livelihood development, as was also mentioned by both speakers before, because people, particularly smallholder communities, they live from those lands, and they need to be able to feed their children and send them to school and improve their livelihoods. So, and often there's a conflict, so how do we manage that conflict? How do we secure livelihoods or make sure they can improve, and also secure the land health? It is about human capacity development, because what I said earlier, it is about, particularly in the end, people have to do it at all levels, the ones who manage the land, or the ones who make the decisions at in a government office at a province level, or the ones who are at national level and write the laws. And then it's also very much about social dynamics and the cohesion, because this has to be done together. You cannot do, work on complex, what we often call wicked problems, on your own as one organization or one community. There's always interaction. So how can people work together? And most importantly, there is no one size fits all. We can generalize it with all the peatlands in Indonesia, but they are very different from place to place, both like geographically or physically as well as socially. We, with my students, one group spent some time in Central Kalimantan, and the others, they spend time in Riau. Culturally very different, so the way people use the land very different. For instance, in Rio, there's a lot of people who were trans migrants, and they're there to earn an income, whereas in Kalimantan you find a lot of the indigenous kind of ethnic groups have much closer connection to the land. So definitely there's no one size fits all, and that's where communication strategies come in negotiating the needs and the specific kind of conditions and options in each and every area. So, and again, that's why public awareness is important and why community engagement is important. So awareness, people need to know. And what do we need to know? We need to know facts. We need to understand, we can only make better decisions if we actually understand, the facts, for instance, about climate change, there's still people in denial because they don't know the facts. Also the facts of consequences, if we don't do certain things, what will be the repercussions? We need to know the regulations. The regulations were made for a reason. So if you don't know them, or if you only know what you cannot do, and because you'll be punished for that, but you don't know why the regulations are there or what your rights are, it's going to be very difficult to act properly. And then you need to know options. And as I said earlier, particularly with options, it's very important that there is no one size fits all. There need to be multiple options that people can work out what is best for them. What is best in terms of, that suits their environment, that suits their family composition, and the labor availability, their access to money, or and their aspirations. That's also different from one place to another, what people want to achieve in life. So the options need to be there, and we need to provide the mechanisms and the capacity builder to make those decisions which fits best. So in addition, people don't only need to know, people need to act to be able to make that change. And acting starts with a decision. Of course, you can act, you can have a behavior or a practice based on force. And that has happened in a lot of development programs in the past, like in the 1960s, the high yielding varieties of rice in some parts of Java were introduced with the army at the buns, and at gunpoint farmers had to plant new varieties. But of course, it's not a sustainable change. It's only sustainable if people do it voluntarily. And you can only change voluntarily if you've made that decision based on information and an analysis yourself. And that both applies in an individual, but also collective, particularly in smallholder communities where the people have small pieces of land and they're dependent on one another. So that collective action also needs to, and collective decision making needs to be facilitated. There needs to be institutional support, of course, in many forms, for people to be able to act. And most importantly, people need to feel ownership over that process of change, not just, as I said earlier, being told what to do, but having worked it out, have ownership, then only you can change and further change for the better in the long run. So what does it mean for communication? So if we look at those three pictures, they kind of actually show three different forms of communication. We're very familiar with the one way, direction of communication. Somebody is sending a message, a lot of the mass media actually do that, there's a message, a lot in education is being done like that, or in a lot of actually programs as well, where people are told to sit in the back, given a cup of tea to keep quiet, and then in the front somebody is just talking to them rather than actually engaging them. But that has changed a lot over time, and more participatory approaches have become more common in many institutions. So because communication is also this exchange of ideas between two people, because, often, by bouncing things back and forth, your ideas become better, become stronger, and you learn from each other, and also you reinforce your thinking, or you get new ideas. And what we see in a more complex world, we see that communication happens at many levels. It's not just only between people, it is between people and institutions, in the mass media and social media. And we are exposed to a lot of information at the moment in this time of age, and we cannot think that if we come in with a small project, or we do a poster or a radio program, that's the only information people get, so they will be influenced, maybe by our ideas, but by other ideas as well. So how do we then manage that in the strategy? And so communication is information, it is exchange, it is not just only sending messages, it's also processes. It can be interpersonal, can be mediated, or a combination. And it can be verbal and non-verbal. And the non-verbal communication is very important as well. We send a lot of messages, sometimes without actually using text. Can be visuals, can be, body language, can be a lot of things. So what does that mean in terms of what we want to achieve with communication? Of course, if it's purposeful communication, we always have a goal, what we want to achieve with that. So we want people to know and act, as we said before. And so depending on how you design it, you only try to achieve awareness, or you actually try to achieve deep knowledge, or you try to achieve really different behaviors, which you need different communication methods and strategies for. As I said earlier, it's very important if you want people to really act on a sustainable basis, you have to make better decisions. So what does it mean? It means developing skills, not just practical skills, but critical skills. How do you analyze? How do you work out that something is better for you? And the most important, what I feel, is people need to be empowered. They need to feel that they can be in charge of that change process. And of course, being able to make better informed decision is a first step in that. Knowing things is another step, but actually having that, also that support and that feeling that you can make those decisions and it will be better for you. That is what I call empowerment. And you can take control over the change process. So what are then the ingredients of a strategy? I'd like to use here, which I use a lot in my courses as well, these 3 coordinates that were listed in a very nice little book on communication for development by Wendy Quarry and Ricardo Ramirez. And it's the 3 C's. It's champions, it's context, and it's communication functions. Now, we all know what champions are, right? And we often use that, being a champion. But actually, if you translate champion into Bahasa Indonesia, it is like juara, but this is not actually, to champion is actually memperjuangkan, it is about, going into a fight on a long term, making sure things happen. So it's not necessarily the person who is the best at something, has the highest education, knows most, has the highest position. It's something who has the persistence and the commitment and the sustainable local change. You need those champions who selalu memperjuangkan tujuannya. You also need to think about context, and that relates to what I said earlier. You know, there's no one size fits all. You have to think about communities. Every community is different, and whether it's ethnic or whether it is the resources they have or the social fabric that exists. The geography is different, the culture is different, the history. And we have to think about stakeholders. Or a stakeholder is somebody who has a stake or an interest in it, but also very often they have different levels of power. And we need to understand that. You know, for instance, particularly peatland areas where there are these large companies out there, you know, who have a lot of power of how they use the land because they have a lot of money, and that often determines their power. So how can you know, smallholder communities actually negotiate that power and determine where they stand? And then the communication functions. We usually distinguish between 6 functions: the telling and the listening functions, and I'll briefly go through them in the next slide. Much more from the ones who know to the ones who don't know or who have less of a stake. So it's policy communication, strategic and educational communication, and the listening functions or sharing functions are participatory communication, advocacy, and organizational communication. So I'll briefly go through those and show you then how they are relevant for peatland, for sustainable peatland management. So policy communication is about informing people of policy or of the law, of the rights, which of course is very important. When we look at Lahiru's kind of diagram of legislation, you should not only have legislation, but people need to know about it. It's making those rules, but also the rights known. And in a way, it is also about persuading people to participate, not only in kind of following the regulations, but also in policy implementation, and kind of adjusting it based onto the possibilities and the needs of the people to make it more likely. Of course, you can have very strict rules, but if people just cannot, you know, comply with it, it's much more difficult than when actually you have people involved in policy formulation implementation. So that, yeah, the laws and the regulations have to be there, but also you have to think about how do you communicate that. Then strategic communication, very often that's called public relations. It's to inform or maintain the relationship with the public, creating goodwill, very often for fund or awareness raising. And it's very important and it's important to build trust, you know, whether it is as a government organization or whether it is as a company, you need to have that trust for people to believe you, whether it is to bring your policies or your programs, or whether it is like a company to bring your products. And so that's a very strong branch of communication. And most people often, when I say do communication, they think I'm doing strategic communication, public relations, which is exactly what I'm not doing. So then we have educational communication, and it's where we're very familiar with. It is about, you know, sharing information, knowledge, or innovations, from the ones who do know to the ones who don't know. And that can be experts, but it can also be, for instance, farmer to farmer. You know, farmers can learn a lot from each other. So again, you can do that in more directional ways or more participatory ways. And it's still also about capacity building and very often targeting behavioral change. And you see in those 2 pictures, it can be, you know, face to face. And I think still some of that is very important, particularly for that local kind of adaptation of knowledge. But you can also work through media, mass media, or for instance, you know, provide tablets with locally suitable information. Then we go to the listening and sharing functions. So advocacy, of course, is lobbying for change in policies. And I know there's a lot of organizations out in Indonesia, particularly with a lot of young people who are very active in that. It's bringing the voices of the people who don't have a voice to those who can make decisions. It is to be able to influence policy. And very often facilitate civic engagement in social issues. And to some extent that is happening within the constituencies of the Peatland organization. So that's really good, so that you really you know what lives among the people. Organization communication is just all about, you know, organizational self-structuring, membership negotiation, active coordination, institutional positioning, just the normal things we do to run projects or organizations. And then participatory, sorry, who's Can you stop drawing on the screen, please?
The committee, could you take off the drawing?
Yeah, it's all good now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Then participatory communication, which is something that's really my field of work. It is about giving voice to stakeholders to negotiate complex issues, be involved in their decision making, which requires also the facilitation of engagement. It facilitates empowerment, and that is actually, you know, that whole area. I think. Pabudi said that, you know, youth as agents of change, we have to give voice to people. Well, actually, you have a voice, you know, it's only how are people going to listen? That's how are you going to make sure that your voice that is there, that you, first of all, you can express it on a platform that people will listen and you really get their attention, or you have a platform where you can have that dialogue. So it's a very important area to be able to engage people in that those sustainable change processes. And you can use tools for that. Like I often use this Lego serious play, which is actually a business methodology, but I use it with farmers, with researchers, to be able to express ideas better. You can do all kinds of other methods, or it can be on social media as well. So very quickly, some observations of the project I did with the students. This was the group who went to Riau. They observed in terms of communication that there's both internal and external sources for the people in the communities. Very important is word of mouth. They have their town meetings, they have their WhatsApp groups, and signage is actually a lot of warnings. It's very instructional and threatening. It's very often the police signs like don't burn, you know, because you'll get a big fine, or that kind of thing. And then there's the external sources, and they get it's the mass media, the news, the radio, social media, and they also search the internet. What their observations were in terms of communication was that a lot of information got lost in top-down communication approaches. And communities struggled making feedback known. The information and context was not always communicated to the people in the villages. There was also a disconnect between a disconnect between knowledge and actions, that people know what they can and can't do, but you know, friends, they know they shouldn't be burning or throwing the cigarette butts, but they still do it for whatever reason. You know, maybe they're not convinced enough, or they have, you know, other reasons to do it. And often there's lack of opportunity to act otherwise because people, you know, have a lot of considerations. There's also a disconnect between community members, different, for instance, women, you know, or young people, minority groups are in the community, and a disconnect between knowledge and actions. And the knowledge is not always maintained well enough, and sometimes ignored despite they have it, you know, because there's other reasons. And common themes that they observed in terms of particularly legal issues is that there's an inconsistency in legal communication methods, a lack of consistent knowledge about legal rights and obligations. The land was primarily viewed as an economic resource, and the law was followed because of fear of punishment, not because of an understanding of the purpose and the rationale of the law. So that's that's why I emphasize that their policy communication so much, because if people only follow because they're afraid to be fined or, you know, to be put to jail, then actually they won't change sustainable behavior. You know, so there is really a need for consistent community legal education strategy. So last slide is really then what does this means in terms of a good strategy for a sustainable peatland management. I ticked here just strategic and organizational communication. It's something that the BRG, for instance, does very well. They have a very strong policy, and most organizations have. So that's basically how you deal with, you know, running initiatives and things like that. But these 4 areas, they really need to be considered for that sustainability and creating ownership. As I said earlier, policy communication, there has to be legal education, and particularly as a rights-based rather than a fear-based approach. There's to be educational communication, which a lot is already there, but it really needs to be specifically targeted to location, needs capacities, needs to be integrated, lands interest versus livelihood interest. And as I mentioned earlier, that critical skill development is extremely important. And the advocacy can be done a lot more effectively. It is about facilitating storytelling. Very often it's very powerful means to do that, and supporting those champions. And then last, but definitely not least, and I find this a very important area, is the participatory communication. How do we facilitate an inclusive community movement? It's about people need to have access to the resources, to the knowledge, to the trainings, to everything. We have to have community dialogues because there's conflicting interests. So, and peatland management versus livelihood. And most important of all is how do we empower people for ongoing involvement and them taking charge of the ongoing change process. And this is particularly where young people can come in and actually, start setting the trends and carry things forward. So that's what I want to share. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Bu Elske. Thank you very much for your presentations and communication strategy, how to make sure an effective communication strategy specifically involving the youth. Now, this is the moment that we are waiting for, the time that we give the audience, give the questions to the presenters, to the resource person. And I noticed there are three very important questions. The first questions from Lewobus Simamora. For Lewobus, could you turn on the mic and you can ask directly the question to the others? Lewobus Simamora.
Yes.
Are you with us?
Hello.
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you. You can directly ask the question.
Thank you, Mr. Introduce myself. My name is Lewopsus Simamora from Jambi University, majoring soil science. My question addresses to all presenters because I cannot choose one. Okay. According to the explanation given earlier, that peatland must be weighted with the aim of preventing forest and land fires. So the question is, what about companies that set up oil palm on peatland in Indonesia? They have implemented a management according to the law. And the last my question is, what companies has the governance clause due to violating the regulation made? Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr.
Okay, thank you, Lewopsus, for your questions. So the first is about the company that already have their plantation in the peatland and the policy of the government to enforce the regulation. Okay, thank you, Lewopsus. Now, I would like to give the second questions from Theodore Surbakti. Yeah, I think I know him. He is the head of Rumah Millennial Indonesia. He asked, if I might ask, is there any possibility in the future for all the people living on Earth to contribute to peatlands or environmental preservation in the form of tax or kind of tax? If the people who do not live in peatland areas pay people who live in peatland area to take care of peatlands, perhaps the peatlands will be preserved or maybe things will be better. Okay, I think this is a proposal that maybe may need response from the speakers. And I think the third question is about the enforcement from, I forget, David Franklin Mandala. He has a question. What is the enforcement of peatland restoration in Indonesia? I think I put aside the question of capital replacement or relocation because it's quite disconnected. But if we have more time, maybe we will have time to answer the question. But let us focus on these three questions. Now, I would like to give the chance first to Pak Budi, and then the second chance to Pak Lahiru, and the third to Bu Elske. Pak Budi?
Thank you for those questions from Lewobus, Theodore, and others. On the rewetting, yes, we do the rewetting to try to put the conditions back as close as the natural conditions of peatland to prevent forest fire first, and also to prevent further decomposition of open and degraded peatland. And how about the regulations regulate the concession holders? For instance, the oil palm company that they already do the water management as defined by the regulations. There are two types of implementing the regulations. One, if the concession, the license for the concession is happened on the area that allowable for such cultivation, then they only should maintain the area, the water table, and the other water management system, hydrological system, as close as possible, not to drain in excess of waters from the peatland areas in their concessions. While for those that it happens to be have the license of the area that that happens to be in the area that's supposed to be on the protected functions, then they have a really tight management of hydrology, and they have to release the license after the license expired. So they could not extend the license on the productions of palm oil on those area. So after the license is ended, then the government need to restore those area back to the protected.
Kerja.
The second questions on taxing
Jam
on
12
of
nih, Bang.
products from peatlands. It's
I'm
nice
sorry, Pak Budi. I'm
to have
sorry,
that,
Pak Budi.
but actually the
There is
matter on the peatland and the productions and the economic system is to internalize actually the externalities on the specific ecosystem. For instance, the peatland, as the peatland have the ecosystem services as water regulations, the climate regulations, carbon storage functions, and also absorptions of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the growth of the vegetations. Actually, it could be done by the mechanisms that it is currently under preparations, currently under formulations, is the presidential decree on the carbon value. So the products that come out from the carbon-rich soil, carbon-rich area, it should be a bit higher in the price of the current price, or in the productions of those products that come out from the carbon-rich area, the emission factors should be factored in the economic calculations, and to put in there the compensations of carbon loss in the area. For some of the certifications, the sustainability certification, for instance, the RSPO, there's an NDPE policy that they put to all the members. NDPE stands for the non-deforestation. There is for those the member of RSPO should not open area, should not do the deforestation, should not do the plantations on peatland. P for P stand for peatland, and E they should not do exploitations of workforce. And so the policy is already there. The internalizations of externalities is what we hope for. So people would avoid to open up or to do the cultivation on peatland unless the cultivation is on the using the paludiculture species, which is the species that is grew naturally on peatland. So for the third question, could you read it again, Pak Ferdinand?
Yeah, the third question is about the enforcement, Pak Budi, the enforcement of peatland restoration. Maybe it's about the policy from Indonesian government or BRG to enforce peatland restoration.
Yeah, the peatland restorations, the enforcement actually lies in the law number 32 years 29. It is against the law to clear the area that it is on the status of protections. And no longer the government will issue license on the area that is that map within the area that is moratorium, that is under the moratorium regulations. So if there's an opening up of area without the license, it's the criminal charging for those who open the area for that. So that's the I hope my answer will satisfy for those who ask the questions.
Thank you so much, Pak Budi, for your answers. And I now would like to invite Pak Lahiru to answer the questions about the tax, the proposal for having tax of peatland. I don't know, the name would be peat tax, maybe. Time is yours, Pak Lahiru.
Okay, I think Pak Budi did a very good outline of what BRG and some of the government regulations are. I have a bit of a different view on some of them because I kind of see most of these regulations as time sensitive. We look at everything at this point in time, but actually everything that happens now is what affects what happens now is what's happened in the past. And though we set up regulations based on now, we also know that in the future that will change and the conditions will change. So I think it's a bit time sensitive. And I say that in the context of the companies. Like if we consider these oil palm and acacia and smallholders on agriculture on peat, when they first established on peat, this understanding of peat as an ecosystem, even though it existed, it wasn't in government at that time. There was very little legislation about unitary hydrological units. That the fact that if you deforest part of a peatland, it affects the other parts of it. So what we have is that we have these peatlands which are fragmented into different parts. One may belong to oil palm, one may be acacia, one may be smallholder, one may be conservation. So about 4 different ministries on the same peat dome. And if all the hydrology is linked, not if all the hydrology is linked, you need to have a management plan that includes all the ministries who don't necessarily correspond with each other. That's for us now to look at it and say, like what Elska mentioned earlier, as scientists, we know what to do. And I think we can say the same thing for climate change. We know globally what needs to be done about climate change, but we can't do it. There's a big difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it. And it's easy to talk about, oh, do this, do that, do this, that's a solution. But to actually go out and do it, to get your hands dirty is the difficult part. Like what Elska mentioned about the communication, you have to really think about carefully how you get these messages across, who has to act and all that stuff. So it's very, very complicated when it comes to companies. And I will tell you one thing, I don't think the companies are stupid either. The companies know that their peatlands are sinking. Under agriculture, they are sinking at 5 centimeters a year. And in about 50 years' time, their peatlands will be flooded and no longer active. So they also know that eventually they have to move to something else. They have to move into some kind of paludiculture or sustainable agriculture on peatlands. The issue is that whether they are actually doing the research to get there. There is no solution right now. And I'm clear about this as a scientist. I know that there is no solution that can be implemented, and we need to start the move towards it. And that's an important thing. That's why we need young people to get involved in it. So that's why I don't think I answer everything directly, but I'm putting your question into context, that we can't look at this as a point in time thing. And it's easy for us to look and say we shouldn't do agriculture on peat. As a scientist, yes, that's true. As practicality, I don't think it's possible. So we need to get that step. The second question from, I think, Theodore is about paying for carbon. That is a very complex one. And I will first say a few things that right now, the paying for carbon thing came up in the early mid 2000s as a RED Plus program, which was to pay countries from avoiding deforestation. They moved from, like, previously countries were paying money for conservation of areas. Suddenly, instead of conservation, people started paying for carbon. And this issue about other countries paying someone else to conserve their forests moved into a carbon realm rather than a conservation. And for 11 years now, we've been talking about it. And in that 11 years, we have seen the massive deforestation of a lot of areas on the planet. We're still talking about it, and there's still not enough money that's going to come. Now, I would like to put that into context of what's happening today with COVID. If you can see what's happening with COVID, the minute this disaster came onto the planet, everyone closed up. Everyone started closing borders, and they started focusing on their own economies. Now, if we look at where we're headed with climate change, we know that the El Nino events that are happening are going to become shorter. All the evidence is showing that they have becoming shorter. And in Indonesia in particular, there's going to be a lot more fires, a lot more droughts in Indonesia than anywhere else in the tropics. And so we know that issue is coming. Now, in this context, if there are other parts of the world who have the money, who have their own problems, will they continue to give money? That's a big question. We don't know. And the other issue is that when we think about Indonesia now, Indonesia is the 10th largest economy in the world. It's the only ASEAN member in the G20, in the global 20 nations with the biggest economies in the world, Indonesia. Indonesia, I think you are one of the richest countries in the world. You have everything that you need to even do everything without aid. The thing about having other people pay for it is, like I mentioned about the drainage issue. Now, what happens if the other countries say we're not going to pay? Are you going to continue to do agriculture on your peat until 21% of your land area sinks into the sea and you have no more land for those people on the peatlands to do agriculture? That's a choice that you have to make. Whether you want to wait for the money, if it comes, it's beneficial. But if you do it, don't do it for the money. Do it because it's your long-term sustainability and your own long-term survival. And a good examples you can see is like Java doesn't produce enough rice now, right? It's imported into the country. So there are issues that people can import stuff from other countries as long as there's production. But you have to be self-sufficient, because when the problems come, no one is going to come and help you if they can't help themselves first. And those problems are coming. So, I mean, I hope that answered your question about the payment for systems. It's a good idea, but in the process, we are losing the point that it's actually up to individuals to act. If you want to sustainably manage your peatlands, it's up to you and your communities to decide. We as scientists on the outside, we can do the science, we can give advice, but the choice on whether to keep it or not is purely Indonesian. It's purely Indonesian communities. It's purely Indonesia's choice to make. And I don't think anybody should impose that on Indonesia either. The last one is about the enforcement of peatland restoration. I think that that's a tough one. I think Pak Budi actually mentioned a lot of it, but I think that more than restoration, we need to look beyond it into sustainable agriculture, because even if you enforce restoration, if we cannot move these peatlands into sustainable agriculture where there's no carbon being lost, the land will be lost. It's not about restoration alone, but the thing is we can't suddenly move into that if there's no solution. So there's a journey that we need to make, which is still another 30 to 40 years. What BRG has done is set up the groundwork for this. And now it's actually up to us to continue that movement. And we shouldn't see this as we will implement one law and that one law will fix everything. It doesn't happen. Laws change with time. So does communities, so do people, so does management. And that's the journey. I hope I answered some of those questions at least. And I think Elske will have even more insights.
Thank you, Lahiru, for your answers. That we are talking about coordination between department and ministry in Indonesia is very, very difficult. It's true, yeah, and that's the importance of leadership, political leadership, something we can touch later on in the next seminar or in the next conference. Thank you, Pak Lahiru, and now I would like to give the floor to Bu Elske.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'll leave the question about the companies. Pak Budi has, very well answered that, and I don't want to burn my fingers here because it's not my area of expertise, and I don't want to say the wrong thing. So, but about the taxes, and again, it's not. I'm not totally familiar with all the details, but I'd just like to take whoever asked the questions, through a bit of a scenario, because in a way, a lot of the activities that are happening in projects all around Indonesia are, government projects are paid from taxes that all the people from Indonesia contribute, right? It could be some government companies, but that's what it mainly is. So a lot of the work that is now, there's people being paid in initiatives, facilitated by the BRG and by the local, the provincial organizations, to do certain things like the re-wetting or the canal blocking, so they are this, and materials are provided, and it's of course paid for by tax money or by public funding. So in a way that's already happening, but people are not aware of, to actually ask people, for instance, I understood the question, it would still be within Indonesia rather than international taxes. But if you're going to ask people in Jakarta whether they want to pay a little bit more tax to support peatland restoration, and because people in the peatlands have a problem that affects them as well, they can also turn it around. Says, yeah, but we have an air pollution problem here because of all the cars that are stuck in traffic in Jakarta. You know all about that. And the solution is to reduce number of cars, but then we need additional money to actually have other means, to use other means of transport, and let the people in Kalimantan pay for that. You see how kind of weird it gets then, So that's not going to be possible. So, and I think to have people do something paid by money from outside, it becomes a project. And that's, I think, the whole problem. Project is not going to provide sustainable change. This has to become a way of doing. And that's why, but we do need a long period of time to get, that's change of mindset of people, both in communities, in local governments, in companies, and work out how they can all contribute to that and take ownership over it. And over time, just do it as a way of life. Yeah? And projects can initiate and have people experience and experiment with new ideas and build those critical skills that they need, but then it just needs to become part of the way they live and manage their environment and their livelihood. So I think the approach should really be there, not short-term solutions, not stopgap solutions, but long-term, okay. And that's why I said that empowerment is so important, that ownership over those processes, and eventually people just have to live a life in sustainable ways then. A little bit, the same actually applies to enforcement. So how is it enforced? What I know is also quite limited, of my experience in Indonesia in other areas of law enforcement, but what we have seen, particularly in Rio when we were there last December, was that it is mainly the police in terms of the peatland restoration, or particularly, the fire management and some other things. It's the police who enforces it. But again, have a metaphor. Think about, it's now law that you wear a helmet on a motorbike, right? Do all of you do that? Maybe in Jakarta, because there's a police officer in every corner of the street, but not when you go back to the village, wherever you come from a village and you think, oh, I'm just going to go quickly through a friend like the wind through, so, that's what it's about. So think about, okay, if the police catches me, what do you do? Sometimes you try to wriggle out of it, That's what we do, at least what you do in Indonesia, right? So that's not going to be the solution. Right, only enforcement through, and that's what I said earlier, through instigation of fear and the threats of fines or incarceration or punishment. It is about actually a rights-based approach. It's about us understanding why the regulations are there and then changing our behaviors voluntarily. Kind of making sure, of course, and what I've seen particularly with people, with wearing helmets, when something happened in their own family, that somebody had a serious accident because they weren't wearing a helmet, then suddenly everyone starts wearing a helmet. So it's a process of what we call conscientization, becoming really deeply aware why those regulations are important, not just, to keep the police busy or rich, but to actually, protect all of us. So that's what I mean. So that's, and that's actually a cultural change that needs to happen, both in the individual and communities, as well as in government and in the police force as well. So that's actually, that's my kind of take on it. So hope that was useful.
Thank you so much, Elske. Yes, I did use my helmet even though I'm in the village. But it is true that sometimes I bribe the police if I got caught. But that's okay. Thank you, Elsa, for your answer. I'm really grateful for having Elske, Lahiru, and Pak Budi in this webinar. On behalf of the Committee of Youth Peatland Conference 2020, we are very thankful for your presence in this webinar. We do hope that you guys, the presenter, can obtain something new from this webinar. And of course, to the all audience, you can also have new knowledge, new insights about sustainable peatland management. And most importantly, I would like to conclude by saying that youth is the most important actor in sustainable peatland management. It is the future and the presence of sustainable peatland management. Without youth, we will be failed in achieving the sustainable peatland management. By saying that, I would like to give the floor to the host again, to Elia. Thank you for trusting me as the moderator. And Elia, time is yours again.
Thank you so much for Mr. Ferdinand. That's been a wonderful moderator for our second day webinar today. And now, on behalf of the team, I would like to thank you all very much, every one of you, Mr. Budi Wardana, Mr. Lahiru Wijdasa, and Ms. Elske van der Veer, for being a wonderful speakers in our second webinar today, and also for giving us knowledge, insights, and fruitful discussion during this session. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, now we will move to our second agenda, design graphic presentation session, and I would like to let myself to lead the next sessions. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we come to graphic presentation session, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Elia Damiria Eneska, who will serve the session as your master of ceremony. And then there will be Mr. Alan Singkali as our moderator in the design graphic presentations. So for Mr. Alan Singkali, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning. Host, can you hear my voice?
Yes, we can clear.
Mr. Singkali cannot attend this meeting, so I will lead the session for the graphic design presentation. Can you set me as a co-host, please? Check. Okay. Can you set me as a co-host, please? So I will
show the participant about their graphic design finalists. And Mr. Sinkali is cannot attend this session, so I will lead this graphic design presentation. First of all, can you set me as a co-host? Okay, thank you. There are 7 finalists for the graphic design presentation, and I will show you all first about their compilation. Okay, that's all the compilation for the graphic design, and each of the finalists will presenting about their works. And first, we inviting Mr. Fedron, Mr. Jovi Fedron, to give us a presentation for his graphic design works.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Fedron, yeah, Mr. Fedron, you have 5 minutes to provide us about your explanation of your graphic design and what's the message that you want to deliver to your what the message that you want to deliver to us.
Okay. Thank you for the time, but I will tell you all of here using Indonesian. Is that all right?
Yes,
I'm
yes,
going
okay.
to. Oh, all right. Ya, terima kasih atas waktunya. Perkenalkan, nama saya Jovi Hones Fedron. Saya dari Universitas Kristen Indonesia, dan saya akan menjelaskan sedikit tentang poster yang saya buat. Nggak bisa ditampilin ya posternya. mungkin bisa ditambah. Jadi dari Oke, terima kasih. Di sini saya membuat 2 poster yang judulnya adalah dari karya menjadi realita. Jadi judul ini saya ambil memiliki tujuan gitu, yaitu mengajak masyarakat, terutama anak-anak muda yang membaca poster ini tidak hanya melihat poster ini, namun juga turut ikut dalam mengetahui dan menjaga lahan gambut kita. Lalu kalau kita lihat, bisa kita lihat di poster yang kedua, saya juga menambahkan sedikit pesan-pesan, contohnya seperti jangan rusak lahan gambut kami, karena jika lahan basah lenyap, banyak spesies tumbuhan dan hewan yang berbeda akan punah. Seperti itu. Jadi poster ini saya coba kemas dalam konsep yang menarik dan disisipkan pesan-pesan yang ada di dalamnya. Dan konsep poster ini sebenarnya adalah komik. Jadi saya mencoba ingin berbeda sedikit daripada poster-poster lingkungan lainnya. Saya mencoba membuat poster dari sesuatu yang saya suka, yaitu komik. Nah, kalau bisa kita lihat, di situ ada 3 karakter utama, yang di paling kiri ada pemadam, di tengah ada anggota BRG, dan yang di kanan ada petani. Nah, di sini ada perannya masing-masing, di mana pemadam juga membantu di mana kasus-kasus kebakaran lahan yang terjadi, mereka membantu juga dalam mengatasinya, dan juga di tengah ada anggota BRG. Di situ saya kenapa masukkan anggota BRG, karena mereka mempunyai fungsi-fungsi sendiri, yaitu kayak BRG itu mempunyai fungsi seperti pengaturan ulang area lahan gambut, sosialisasi edukasi, dan juga menentukan dan perlindungan budidaya lahan gambut ini. Dan juga saya ingin cerita sedikit dari lahan gambut ini. Jujur saja saya sebelumnya tidak memperhatikan lahan gambut ini, tapi semenjak saya mengikuti lomba ini, saya semakin tertarik dalam mengetahui lahan gambut, lahan basah, dan semuanya. Dalam pembuatan poster ini, saya sendiri menggunakan 2 teknik. Jadi saya menggunakan teknik digital juga, saya menggunakan teknik tradisional juga. Dan yang seperti yang kita lihat yang di tengah ini, saya gambar sendiri menggunakan buku sketsa, lalu scan, lalu saya tempel. Jadi penggabungan keduanya itu. Jadi tujuan saya membuat poster ini adalah dengan memadukan karya digital dan tradisional, saya berharap poster ini dapat menarik perhatian masyarakat, terutama anak-anak muda, untuk lebih memahami dan menyadari kondisi lahan gambut kita saat ini. Akhir kata, lahan basah dan lahan gambut adalah bagian yang indah dari ekosistem kita. Dan lahan basah harus kita jaga. Jadi semoga poster ini dapat memberikan dampak positif bagi para pembaca dan bisa menjadi realita juga. Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fedron. And next, Mr. Yedija. Okay, Mr. Yedija is here. You have 5 minutes to explain about your graphic design. Please take your time.
Thank you for attention. Now, sekarang saya ingin menjelaskan. Saya pertama minta maaf karena tidak menyiapkan slide seperti saudara pertama tadi. Namun, saya ingin menceritakan pengenalan atau awal perkenalan saya dengan gambut. Memang saya berasumsi pertama bahwa kata gambut sendiri barangkali tidak banyak diketahui oleh masyarakat umum, khususnya pemuda Indonesia. Mungkin kata gabut singkatan dari gaji buta, maupun gabut dari kata tidak akan mengetahui apa-apa, lebih banyak diketahui dari kata gambut sendiri. Padahal kalau kita lihat, Indonesia merupakan negara pertama yang memiliki lahan gambut terluas di Asia Tenggara dan di negara-negara tropis di dunia, dan membuat juga lahan gambut Indonesia paling besar terempat di dunia. Nah, lahan gambut saya sendiri sebenarnya sederhana, di mana saya seorang mahasiswa pertanian waktu itu ingin menyelesaikan tugas akhir. Saya melihat bahwa banyak lahan gambut di Bengkulu, dan pemanfaatannya terus dimanfaatkan secara luar biasa, sehingga saya mengajukan proposal saya untuk meneliti lahan gambut ini yang sudah terdegradasi atau sudah berulang kali dimanfaatkan oleh masyarakat untuk lahan tanamannya, sehingga ketika bahan organiknya habis, mengalami degradasi bahan organik, sehingga terbengkalai, tidak digunakan lagi. Lalu saya meneliti ini dengan memanfaatkan bahan-bahan organik seperti pupuk kandang sapi, lalu tandan kelapa kosong, kelapa sawit yang saya padukan. Ternyata hasilnya tidak jauh berbeda juga dengan tanah-tanah mineral. Bahkan ada satu cerita dosen saya di mana hasil tanaman selada saya yang saya berikan kepada dosen itu disimpannya di dalam kulkas selama 1 bulan. Ketika dikeluarkan, hasilnya tetap segar. Memang harus ada proses lanjutan di mana meneliti ini kenapa bisa tahan sampai sesegar itu selama 1 bulan. Lalu saya melihat juga problema gambut ini kan, dulu saya juga berstigma negatif. Saya kurang mengenal gambut, di mana tahun 2015 di Riau terjadi kebakaran besar dan didominasi oleh hutan-hutan gambut. Wah, ternyata hutan-hutan gambut ini penyebab pemicu kebakaran hingga menyebabkan ada krisis ekonomi di beberapa daerah waktu itu. Bahkan sampai 2 negara komplain karena kiriman asap di negaranya karena kebakaran tersebut. Saya melihat memang persoalan gambut kita ini kan sebenarnya kalau kita lihat, kalau kita analisis, gambut ini bentuknya seperti spons. Artinya bisa menyimpan air 1000 kali 100, bisa menyimpan air 100 kali dari beban gambut sendiri. Namun karena tidak bagus tidak bagus penerapan di dalam pintu-pintu air di areal gambut ini, sehingga menyebabkan gambut terus mengeluarkan air dengan banyak dari sehingga keberadaan air di dalam gambut semakin sedikit dan membuat tanah gambut semakin mudah mengering, akhirnya mudah terbakar. Di lain sisi memang karena spesifik gambut ini yang kering tadi, sehingga semakin mudah menyimpan api di dalamnya. Makanya kalau kita lihat tanah gambut yang terbakar mau dalam 1 minggu, 1 bulan, bahkan ada lebih dari 1 bulan. Itu membuat problema gambut kita mudah terbakar, dan tanah gambut kita pun memiliki stigma negatif juga di masyarakat karena itu. Makanya kita berharap dengan adanya restorasi gambut ini ke depan ada regulasi atau hukum yang mengatur bagaimanapun orang-orang atau perusahaan-perusahaan yang ingin memanfaatkan gambut, yang mengalihfungsikan gambut untuk lahan-lahan, bisa membuat regulasi lebih baik lagi dan diaktualisasikan lebih baik lagi. Dan juga seperti saya katakan tadi, kanal-kanal air ini kalau bisa difungsikan kembali dengan teknologi terapan, di mana nanti pintu-pintu di area gambut itu ditetapkan dan diperhatikan tingginya, lebarnya, dan diharapkan supaya gambut menahan air yang keluar dan masuk ke dalam gambut itu sendiri. Saya pikir semua pihak harus bekerja sama, tidak terlepas dari peran pemerintah dan juga masyarakat, dan secara khusus pemuda yang saat ini mengambil peran yang lebih besar sekarang dan di beberapa waktu yang akan datang. Terima kasih. Mengingat juga lahan gambut yang sangat luas di Indonesia dan manfaat yang sangat begitu besar kalau bisa kita manfaatkan dengan baik. Terima kasih. Thank you for attention, Mr. Dori, love you and for all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Manulang, for your message that you want to deliver to us through your works. Okay, and next, Miss Purbasari. Okay, Miss Purbasari is here. You have 5 minutes to giving us a presentation about your graphic design. Miss Purbasari, okay.
Oke, thank you for the terima kasih atas kesempatannya. Mungkin saya minta izin untuk mempresentasikan desain saya menggunakan bahasa Indonesia. Baik, sebelumnya perkenalkan, nama saya Kania Purbasari, bisa dipanggil Kania. Saya mahasiswa semester 5, jurusan Biologi, Fakultas Matematika Ilmu Pengetahuan Alam di Universitas Riau. Baik, saya akan mempresentasikan mengenai poster saya yang berjudul Mengenal Pentingnya Sekat Kanal atau Kanal Blocking. Kemudian saya terpaku atau mengarah pada pemandangan banyaknya sekat kanal, dan kemudian saya bertanya, untuk apa sekat kanal ini begitu. Kemudian saya mewawancarai atau ngobrol dengan keluarga saya sendiri apa maksud dari pembuatan sekat kanal ini, dan ternyata sebenarnya jika kita lihat ternyata sekat kanal ini berfungsi untuk mencegah terjadinya kebakaran gambut. Makanya di poster ini saya berusaha untuk memperkenalkan apa peran dari sekat kanal ini kepada masyarakat luas dengan bahasa yang sederhana dan informasi-informasi yang membuka pikiran bagi berbagai kalangan masyarakat dengan bahasa-bahasa yang sederhana. Bahkan saya rasa poster ini bisa membantu teman-teman mahasiswa jurusan biologi mengetahui sekat kanal. Karena bahkan masyarakat Riau saja banyak yang tidak tahu apa itu sekat kanal, karena hanya ada di beberapa daerah pedalaman yang masih membangun sekat kanal itu sendiri. Dan banyak yang berspekulasi bahwa keberadaan sekat kanal ini, banyak yang mengatakan bahwa itulah yang menyebabkan terjadinya kebakaran, padahal sebenarnya tidak. Dan saya mengambil beberapa referensi dan saya olah dengan kata-kata yang sederhana, dan saya paparkan sedikit fakta-fakta yang menarik dari lahan gambut itu sendiri, keberadaan lahan gambut di Indonesia, dan apa yang menyebabkan kebakaran lahan gambut ini sangat berbahaya. Mungkin itu dari saya. Intinya poster sekat kanal gambut ini saya bertujuan agar masyarakat membuka pikirannya, mengetahui setidaknya sedikit mengenai peranan sebenarnya dari lahan gambut. Sekian dari saya, Mas. Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you, Miss Purbasari. And next, Miss Samosir, Helen Samosir. Is Miss Helen Samosir here? Miss Helen Samosir. Okay. Next, Mr. Levi Simanungkali. Okay, Mr.
Yes,
Levi. Yeah, you have 5 minutes to give us presentation about your graphic design.
Maybe the committee share my design. Number 11. No. Yes. Yes. Okay. I will describe my design in bahasa. Pandemi dan kebakaran lahan gambut sama-sama membunuhmu.
Kenapa saya membuat poster ini atau desain ini? Karena satu, yang kita ketahui saat ini ialah pandemi COVID-19 yang baru-baru ini sangat melanda Indonesia dan sangat tidak nyaman bagi aktivitas ekonomi kita. Kemudian kebakaran juga sama seperti halnya pandemi ini. Kita ketahui di fenomena kebakaran lahan gambut sudah menjadi langganan bencana di Indonesia karena tidak adanya penanganan serius. Kenapa lagi saya buat poster ini? Di Jambi sendiri tahun lalu 2019 yaitu langit ataupun cuaca keadaan sekarang gara-gara kebakaran itu pada waktu itu langit menjadi merah ibaratnya gara-gara diakibatkan oleh kebakaran lahan gambut, asap mempengaruhi udara dan membuat anak-anak ataupun orang tua hanya keluar 5 menit dari rumah sudah efeknya mengakibatkan sesak nafas. Tentu hal itu menjadi sangat-sangat menjadi hal yang tidak nyaman bagi pernafasan kita, kehidupan kita. Jadi kebakaran lahan gambut dan pandemi ini sama-sama membunuh. Jadi inovasi oleh BRG ataupun teman-teman yang lain tetap dilanjutkan demi menjaga lahan gambut. Thank you, sir. Enough.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Simanung Khalid, for giving us a presentation about your graphic design. And next, we inviting Samuel Purba, Mr. Purba. Is Mr. Purba here? Mr. Samuel Purba. Okay. Mr. Samuel Purba. Okay, Mr. David Lubis. Okay, Mr. David Lubis is not attend our meeting. And Miss Helena Samosir. Is Miss Helena Samosir? Okay, I think it's enough for our session. There are 3 finalists that hasn't come to our session. So I'm giving back this session to host.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dodi Lapihu, as our moderator for design graphic presentations. Now we will proceed to break session for an hour. So all participants, we hope to see you in about 1 hour from now. Maybe we'll start at 1 p.m. Thank you very much. God bless you.